Every headline this month says the same word: escalation. But look closer at what's actually being signed, inspected, and quietly negotiated behind those headlines, and you'll see something no one's pointing out. Wars usually look like this right before they end, not before they explode. I want you to hold on to that idea for the next 35 minutes, okay? Because on the surface, the last 2 weeks of this war look like a full-blown collapse of diplomacy. Iran struck commercial tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. Trump stood at the NATO summit and declared the ceasefire over. The U.S. launched close to 200 strikes across Iran in 48 hours. Iran retaliated by hitting American military positions in 4 separate countries: Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. Tehran formally declared the strait closed. By every surface-level reading, that's the language of a war getting worse, not a war winding down. But here's what almost nobody connected in the same week. A senior U.S. official told CNN that Washington and Tehran were still working toward a nuclear deal by mid-August, even as those strikes were happening. That same official said planned strikes for Thursday night had actually been called off in favor of continued diplomacy, even while fighter jets sat loaded on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln in case they were needed. Central Command said commercial vessels could continue lawfully transiting the strait, directly undercutting Iran's own closure declaration. And gasoline futures, the single most sensitive real-time indicator of how seriously global markets take a Middle East oil threat, barely moved. So which is it? Is this a war spiraling back toward chaos, or is this what the final hardest stretch of a negotiated ending actually looks like from the outside? Today, I'm going to walk through 3 competing explanations for what these last 2 weeks actually represent, using nothing but on-record reporting from Axios, CNN, the IAEA's own Director General, and real-time market data. And then I'm going to show you why the pattern we're watching right now isn't the war restarting. It's a specific, well-documented historical pattern that shows up again and again right before major conflicts actually end. 3 theories, same set of events, only one framework explains all of it. Are you ready? Let's go. Before I get into the evidence, you need the 3 theories by name, because if you don't understand the categories, you can't judge the evidence properly, okay? Theory number 1 is what I'll call the Reignition Theory. This says exactly what the headlines suggest. The ceasefire genuinely collapsed. This war is restarting from something close to scratch, and everything that came before, the memorandum, the nuclear talks, the sanctions framework, is effectively dead. Theory number 2 is what I'll call the parallel tracks theory. This is 2 separate processes are running simultaneously and independently. A military track that's genuinely escalating, and a diplomatic track that's genuinely continuing with no real relationship between the 2. And theory number 3, the one I'm going to build for you today, I call the Terminal Escalation Pattern. This says the military flare-ups we're watching right now aren't happening, despite the negotiation reaching its final stage. They're happening precisely because it's reaching its final stage, a well-documented historical pattern where the fiercest fighting of any war often occurs in the exact weeks before it actually ends, not the weeks before it gets permanently worse. Let's take them one at a time. Theory 1, the reignition. I want to be fair to this theory first because the raw military facts genuinely support it on their face. Here's the strongest version of the case. Trump's own words at the NATO summit were about as final as political language gets. I think it's over. I don't want to deal with them anymore. Within hours, nearly 200 strikes hit Iranian soil over 2 days, the largest coordinated bombing campaign since the April ceasefire took hold. Iran's retaliation wasn't contained to a single front. It spanned 4 separate countries simultaneously, the broadest multi-nation response of the entire war. Tehran didn't just threaten the Strait of Hormuz, it formally officially declared it closed. If you're measuring this war by kinetic activity alone, number of strikes, number of countries involved, breadth of retaliation, this 2-week window represents one of its most intense stretches since the opening days back in February. And there's real historical precedent for taking that escalation at face value. Ceasefires collapse. Memoranda of understanding get abandoned. Diplomatic frameworks that look promising on paper regularly fall apart the moment either side decides the cost of walking away is lower than the cost of continuing to negotiate. Iran's own foreign ministry has repeatedly and publicly called direct negotiations with Washington meaningless, even during periods when substantive talks were clearly happening behind the scenes. Given that pattern, why should anyone assume this particular escalation is different from any other moment a fragile ceasefire has broken down throughout this 18-month conflict? So if you're looking for a simple explanation, this is a defensible one. The war escalated, because the war is in fact escalating. No hidden pattern required. But here's the problem, and this is the single most important question in this entire video, okay? So pay attention to this one. If this were a genuine full reignition of the war, Why did the same senior U.S. official who confirmed the strikes to CNN also confirm, in the same conversation, that Washington and Tehran were still actively working toward a nuclear deal by mid-August, and that a planned round of additional strikes had been deliberately called off specifically to preserve that diplomatic track? Think about that combination carefully. A government that has genuinely abandoned diplomacy doesn't simultaneously maintain an active, dated target for a comprehensive nuclear agreement. You don't call off planned military strikes to protect a negotiation you've already decided is dead. That specific decision, strike, then deliberately hold back further strikes to keep the deal alive, is not what reignition looks like. It's what something else looks like. Theory 2, the parallel tracks. This is a reasonable middle position, and I want to give it a fair hearing before building my own synthesis. This theory says the military and diplomatic tracks are simply running independently of each other, not because they're connected by any deliberate strategy, but because different parts of each government are pursuing different goals with different timelines, and the appearance of coordination is really just coincidence. There's some real support for this. Iran's foreign ministry has a well-documented habit of publicly downplaying negotiations, even while its own spokespeople confirm, in detail, that intensive technical talks are ongoing, a pattern rooted in how Iranian diplomacy manages separate domestic and international audiences. It's entirely plausible that Iran's military and political wings aren't fully coordinated with each other either, meaning IRGC commanders might order retaliatory strikes for reasons entirely separate from whatever Iran's negotiating team is doing in parallel talks with mediators. Under this theory, the diplomatic track survives the military escalation, not because the escalation is calculated to support it, but simply because neither side has formally pulled the plug on it yet. And both processes are simply proceeding on their own separate momentum until one of them eventually wins out. That's a coherent way to explain the apparent contradiction without assuming any grand strategy on either side. Bureaucracies are messy. Wartime governments often have genuinely disconnected military and diplomatic apparatuses. But this theory runs into a specific problem when you look closely at the timing and sequencing of the actual decisions, not just their existence. The CNN reporting doesn't describe two disconnected tracks operating on separate tracks by accident. It describes a specific, deliberate choice. Strikes were planned and then called off in favor of continuing the diplomatic track, according to the same official describing both events. That's not parallel tracks, running independently. That's one track being actively subordinated to protect the other, which points toward something more coordinated than pure coincidence. The data, what actually happened, week by week. Now let me give you the actual granular timeline, because theory without data is just storytelling. And this is the section that shows you exactly why the terminal escalation pattern fits better than either of the first two theories. Go all the way back to February 17th, weeks before the current war's most intense phase, when Iran and the U.S. held a second round of nuclear talks in Geneva. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi told reporters directly that both sides had reached an understanding on the main guiding principles, though he cautioned that progress didn't mean an agreement was imminent. That's worth remembering, because it establishes that substantive, structural nuclear negotiations were already advancing even before the war's most violent phase began on February 28th. By late May, according to Axios' detailed reporting citing a U.S. official directly, both sides were closing in on a specific draft agreement, a 60-day ceasefire extension, a reopened Strait of Hormuz, Iran freely selling oil again, and formal negotiations over curbing the nuclear program. Critically, that draft included actual substantive commitments from Iran to never pursue nuclear weapons, to negotiate a suspension of uranium enrichment, and to negotiate the removal of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. The same official noted something important about incentive structure. Iran's own economic crunch, not American pressure alone, was what gave Tehran a real reason to finalize a full deal removing sanctions and unfreezing its cash. That's not a description of two sides drifting toward permanent conflict. That's a description of both sides working out the mechanics of an actual exit. By mid-June, that memorandum was formally signed in Islamabad, establishing the 60-day clock that's still technically running today. And by June 26th, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi confirmed publicly at a press conference in Tokyo that the agreement specifically gives UN nuclear inspectors access to Iran's nuclear sites, stating directly that whatever disagreement existed over the details, what is undeniable is that we have an MOU, and that the nuclear component of that memorandum will be supervised. Building an actual verification and inspection architecture into an agreement is not something governments typically do in the middle of a war they expect to keep fighting indefinitely. It's something governments do when they're constructing the technical scaffolding for an actual lasting settlement. Then came the first 2 weeks of July, and this is where the apparent contradiction lives. On July 6th and 7th, Iran struck tankers in the Strait. On July 8th, Trump declared the ceasefire over at the NATO summit, and nearly 200 strikes hit Iran within 48 hours. Iran retaliated across 4 countries. Tehran declared the strait closed. On its face, that's the most violent stretch of the war since the original ceasefire took hold back in April. But look at what was happening in the exact same window according to CNN's own sourcing. The same senior official who confirmed the scale of the strikes also confirmed that Washington and Tehran were still actively targeting a comprehensive nuclear deal by mid-August, just weeks away. That official specifically described a round of planned additional strikes for Thursday night that was deliberately called off, in favor of preserving the ongoing diplomatic track, even as fighter jets remained loaded and ready aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln in case the decision needed to be reversed. Central Command, rather than escalating its own rhetoric to match Iran's strait closure declaration, instead issued a calm, factual statement that commercial vessels could continue lawfully transiting the waterway, directly and deliberately, undercutting the panic that a genuine closure would have created. And in the market itself, gasoline futures rose only to a 7-week high of roughly $3.20 before falling back toward $3 within days, with trading economics explicitly attributing that retreat to continued technical negotiations between the U.S. and Iran persisting despite the renewed hostilities. Professional traders, who have direct financial incentives to price real risk accurately, were reading this exact same set of events and concluding the underlying deal was still very much alive. Theory 3. The Terminal Escalation Pattern. Now let me put it all together because this is where the real explanation lives, and it requires understanding something well established in the history of how wars actually end, not how they continue. Here's the core idea. Negotiated endings to wars are almost never smooth. Linear de-escalations where violence steadily tapers off until a peace agreement gets signed. Historically, the opposite pattern shows up far more often. The fiercest, most dramatic fighting of an entire conflict frequently occurs in the exact weeks or months immediately before a final settlement. Because both sides understand that whatever territory, leverage, or demonstrated resolve they can establish right before the ink dries becomes the baseline they're locked into once the agreement takes effect. This is precisely why so many historical armistices were preceded by intense spikes in violence rather than a gradual calm, both sides racing to maximize their position in the final window before the terms. Freeze in place. That's exactly the shape of what's happening here. Iran's tanker strikes and its 4-country retaliation aren't random reignitions of a dead war. They're Tehran establishing, in the clearest possible terms, that it retains meaningful capability to disrupt shipping and strike American positions across the region, right up until the moment a final nuclear agreement locks in sanctions relief and a settled framework. Washington's nearly 200 strikes aren't abandoning the mid-August deal target. They're demonstrating overwhelming continued military superiority, specifically to ensure Iran enters the final phase of nuclear negotiations from a position of maximum pressure rather than perceived American hesitation. Both sides are using this window of intensified violence to shape the leverage they'll carry into the actual final agreement, not to destroy the possibility of that agreement altogether. And the specific decision CNN reported, calling off a planned round of strikes specifically to protect the diplomatic track while keeping jets loaded in case that calculation needs to change, is the clearest possible signature of this pattern. That's not the behavior of a government that has concluded diplomacy has failed. That's the behavior of a government carefully calibrating just enough continued military pressure to maintain leverage while deliberately avoiding the one action, a strike so severe it would make continued negotiation impossible, that would actually kill the deal it's still working toward. The IAEA's own confirmation that the nuclear component of the memorandum will be formally supervised, that inspectors already have access under the agreement, is the technical architecture of an actual ending being built in real time, not something either side would bother constructing if they'd already decided this war has no exit. And the market's own muted reaction ties directly back into this same pattern. Professional traders, whose money's on the line if they misjudge this, are not pricing this escalation the way they priced the war's genuinely uncertain opening months, back when nobody knew whether negotiations would ever produce anything concrete. They're pricing it the way markets price the final, tense negotiating stretch of an agreement everyone already expects to eventually land. Exactly the kind of environment where dramatic headlines coexist with calm futures markets because the people with real money on the table have already concluded the fireworks are theater around a deal, not evidence. The deal is dead. That's the terminal escalation pattern. It's not that the war is quietly winding down while looking calm. It's that this specific, violent, dramatic-looking stretch, tanker strikes, a declared ceasefire collapse, nearly 200 strikes, 4-country retaliation, a formally declared strait closure, is precisely what the last hard mile of a negotiated ending to a modern war actually looks like from the outside. and the diplomatic infrastructure quietly running underneath it, the mid-August target, the IAEA supervised inspection framework, the deliberately withheld additional strikes, the calm CENTCOM statements, and the market's own muted reaction is the real signal that should be weighted far more heavily than the headlines currently allow it to be. 3 things to watch for in the next 30 days. All right, we're almost at the end, and I want to give you 3 specific things to track, because this is how you test a theory like this. You make predictions and see if the evidence matches. Prediction number 1. Watch whether the mid-August target date for a comprehensive nuclear deal actually produces a formal announcement or gets pushed back without being abandoned entirely. If the terminal escalation theory holds, expect continued military flare-ups right up until that date, followed by a genuine, substantive agreement rather than another indefinite postponement. Prediction number 2. Watch whether the U.S. continues holding back the most severe strikes available to it, the ones that would genuinely make continued negotiation impossible, even while continuing smaller-scale demonstrations of military pressure. The pattern of significant strikes, but deliberately withheld maximum escalation, is the clearest tell that Washington is still managing this toward a settlement rather than toward open-ended war. Prediction number 3. Watch IAEA inspector access on the ground inside Iran over the coming weeks. If inspectors are actually granted meaningful expanding access to nuclear sites, even gradually, even amid continued rhetorical disputes like the one Grossi already described, that's substantive, verifiable evidence. The technical framework of a real ending is being built in practice, not just promised on paper. Here's your homework, and I mean this seriously. I want you to go find the actual CNN reporting on the planned Thursday night strikes that were called off, and read the specific language the official used about the mid-August nuclear deal target. Then compare that language to Trump's own "I think it's over" quote from the NATO summit just days earlier. Ask yourself honestly whether a government that had truly abandoned diplomacy would still be organizing its entire military posture around protecting a dated deadline for a comprehensive agreement. If you find something that contradicts what I've laid out today, come argue with me in the comments. I mean that. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look at the same 2 weeks and ask a harder question than, is this war getting worse? The question worth asking is this. When every major war in modern history that actually ended in a negotiated settlement went through a period of intensified violence in its final weeks, why do we keep treating that exact pattern as proof a current war is spiraling out of control, instead of recognizing it as the single most consistent signal that a real ending might actually be close? Sit with that question. Look at the timeline we covered today, the February Geneva progress, the May draft agreement, the June IAEA confirmation, the July escalation running in parallel with a still active mid-August target, and I think you'll start to notice something the headlines were never built to show you. I'll see you in the next one.